Hello and welcome to This Day in Europe. A major diplomatic test played out in Beijing today. Top European leaders met with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang for the 25th EU-China summit. Now, the meeting came at a very critical time amidst rising trade tensions, deep geopolitical rifts, and a strained global economy. This year's summit marks 50 years of diplomatic relations, but the event was far from celebratory, lasting just one day. Some suggest it was still packed with significance, but it remains to be seen what exactly comes from this summit. So let's get to it. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa came to Beijing with a very clear message. Europe wants a more balanced partnership and is no longer willing to tolerate what it calls unfair trade practices or strategic ambiguity. Von der Leyen said the EU's relationship with China is, quote, at an inflection point, and that real solutions are needed to rebalance trade and ensure fair competition. To give you an idea of numbers here, the EU's trade deficit with China hit a record 306 billion euros last year. And that has Brussels worried about Europe becoming perhaps dangerously dependent on Chinese overproduction in sectors like electric vehicles, solar panels, and critical raw materials. European officials argue that Chinese industrial overcapacity fueled by state subsidies is distorting global markets and threatening European jobs. Well, China certainly had something to say about that. But interestingly enough, for his part, Xi Jinping adopted a rather measured tone. In his opening remarks, Xi Jinping called the EU a, quote, strategic force in a multipolar world, but warned against what he described as protectionism and the tendency to build walls or break supply chains. He also described their relationship as being at a, quote, critical juncture and suggested that both sides must make the right strategic choices. Xi said he wants to see respect for each other, seeking common ground while shelving differences and building a more stable partnership. Beijing is especially concerned about Europe's recent anti-subsidy investigations targeting EVs and the tightening of controls on foreign investment. In response, as we previously reported on AnewZ, China launched its own probes into EU exports, including wine and brandy, essentially a trade standoff that now clouds what was once a booming economic relationship. Another flashpoint was the EU's demand for predictable access to rare earths, which are critical for Europe's green and defense industries. There is no doubt that China has clear dominance here with its tremendous global rare earth supply chains and recently introducing new export restrictions. All that has forced Brussels to push for guarantees on long-term licenses. Trade aside, Ukraine was and remains a huge issue, with both sides still deeply divided. Von der Leyen reiterated that China's continued economic support for Russia, particularly its dual-use exports, is undermining efforts to end the war. She told reporters after the closed-door talks that, quote, China must not enable Russia's war economy. Peace requires responsibility from all major powers. Chinese officials just waved off her criticism as groundless and instead urged Brussels to focus on, quote, pragmatic cooperation to avoid turning the summit into a geopolitical battleground. But Beijing also criticized the bloc's sanctions announced last Friday, which will impact two Chinese banks over claims they are facilitating trade with Russia. All this certainly made for a rather tense time. However, some progress was spotted, at least symbolically. Both sides committed to continued dialogue on climate change, with Beijing and Brussels pledging to work on a joint declaration ahead of COP30 in Brazil this November. The EU is pushing for firmer Chinese commitments on emissions, though details remain vague at this point.